In the preoperational stage, children begin to represent the world with words, images, and drawings. And this lasts from about 2 to 7 years of age. They form stable concepts and begin to reason, use their reasoning abilities. There are 2 substages to this stage: the symbolic function substage and the intuitive thought substage. In this stage, the preoperational stage, children do not yet perform what's called operations. And these are reversible mental actions that allow children to do mentally what they previously only did physically. And so a good example, I know it's a little wordy, here in a couple slides we'll get into a pretty good example that's called conservation, the conservation task. With preoperational stage, the first substage, the symbolic function substage, the children gains the ability to mentally represent an object that is not actually present. This is about 2 to 4 years of age, and so the kid will draw things and try to design things that represent maybe people or houses or cars. And they'll begin to use language and they'll begin to do pretend play. I have a video of Leif. One day we went to the zoo, we came back home and he had some chalk and he was out on the sidewalk and he drew this blue, I could tell it was a blue kind of a curve like that. And I was like, Leif, what did you draw? And he goes, it's a dolphin. And I was like, oh, yes, it is a dolphin. It was blue and kind of shaped like this. And so he saw that at the zoo, he comes home and he draws that. And yes, pretend play. There are 2 important limitations to this substage: egocentrism and animism. Egocentrism is the inability to distinguish one's own perspective from someone else's perspective. A great example that I have with Leif all the time is if I'm talking to somebody on the phone and I'll put it on speaker and I'll say, can you say hello to Mama? And he'll go, he won't say anything. He'll wave. He waves to people all the time that can't see him. Like if we're leaving daycare, I'm like, you want to say bye? They'll have their back turned and And so he is doing that because he can't understand that he sees things from his perspective, and that's all he can understand. He can't put himself in someone else's shoes to understand that they can't physically see what he is doing. And so that's egocentrism. With animism, it's the belief that inanimate objects have lifelike qualities and are capable of action. If a kid says something like, the sun comes out today because it likes me, that's animism. Some adults will still do things like this too. Like if you hear somebody go, this computer hates me. Obviously, the computer doesn't have that kind of abilities. On figure 4, there is the 3 mountains task. And this can kind of give you an idea of where they're going with this idea of not being able to take another person's perception. So if you want to read through that, feel free. Figure 5 shows some drawings for some kids. And so this is an 11-year-old boy's drawing of a Christmas tree. Fairly good. A 3.5-year-old takes a little bit of liberties, artistic liberties with their perception. So this is a seal kissing a pelican. So this one's much more realistic, but it's much more, it's not near as inventive as this one here is. The imagination, you have to have some imagination with this one. On the intuitive thought substage, the child will use primitive reasoning and they want to know the answers to all sorts of questions. So why becomes a big part of their vocabulary at this point. It is the second stage of the preoperational thought. It is between 4 and 7 that this happens. They are a little bit primitive in this period. As an example, a kid will have kind of an understanding of how to cross a street, but they just can't quite figure out things like the timing. If they see cars, they just can't quite grasp all of the sensations, perceptions, all the things that are quite going on to be able to do something that takes a lot of abilities, being able to cross a street. So they have an idea, but it's just kind of primitive and they can't quite get it exactly right all the time. And again, yes, why questions become very prominent and they signal the emergence of interest in figuring out how things are, why things are. Again, kids at this stage and even earlier think more like scientists than the vast majority of adults that you're going to encounter today. Kids are trying to figure things out. Most adults, not so much, just trying to get through the day. But the kids' day, it's all about just trying to get things figured out. This stage is called intuitive because young children seem unaware of how they know what they know. There are some limits to preoperational thought: centration and conservation. With centration, this is focusing the attention on one characteristic to the exclusion of all others. That's centration. I'll come back to it in a second. Conservation, the awareness is that altering the appearance of an object doesn't change its basic properties. And so figure 6 shows Piaget's conservation task. And this is a pretty good example of what's going on here. If you show a kid A and B, they're the exact same container. The kid can see they're the same container. and then you take B and you pour it into C. The liquid is the same amount, but the container has changed. For a lot of kids, they're going to do this centration where they only focus on how tall this is. And if you ask them, you say, which one has more liquid? They're going to say this one, even though they saw you take it from the same sized container. Because again, all they can focus on is that one thing. It's taller, it must have more. They have to have the ability to perform operations, to mentally reverse this. So they need to be able to think to themselves, okay, if I take C and I pour it into B, which one's going to have more then? And then they're going to be able to realize, oh, it was the same amount. And so when they can do that, they're said to be able to pass this conservation task. Again, conservation, with another thing with Piaget's theory, is it probably comes earlier than Piaget thought, and attention is especially important in explaining conservation. You can kind of explain this to kids, and you can maybe teach them to do it earlier than Piaget thought. Children about 7 or 8 get it right, and if they don't, they're considered still be in the preoperational stage, meaning that they cannot, it's pre-operations, that they can't perform the operations or the mentally reversible actions. And yes, other psychologists, contemporary psychologists, thinks that Piaget maybe underestimated kids and that you could teach them to pass this task. There's some other examples in Figure 7 that go through some dimensions of conservation. Like if you take 2 balls of clay and you roll one out and you ask them which one, has more, they should be able, if they can pass the conservation test, they'll say they both have the same amount. That's the pre-operational stage. Next, we'll get into the concrete operational stage.